Please welcome to the stage from Crowd Lab, Director of Strategy and Business Development, Mr. Thomas Elliott. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Astrid, for that introduction, and thank you, everybody, for listening to me in English for the next 20 minutes. I really appreciate that. Over the last 12 months, we've had another incredible 12 months of record-breaking temperatures and extreme weather events all around the world. And now, even more of us recognize the threat that climate change poses both to us and to future generations. The latest report produced from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was released in October last year. It contained over 1,000 pages of analysis, which was summarized into 32 pages for policymakers, from which there was one media headline, more or less. And that was, we've got 12 years. 12 years to halve global CO2 emissions of approximately 40 gigatons per year and hold the global average temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Unfortunately, despite that relatively simple headline message, it's not that straightforward. And that's generally because climate change is such an overwhelmingly complex topic with such a huge range of opinions and viewpoints. Our research at the Crowther Lab aims to try and simplify this topic by generating a more holistic and spatial perspective on the climate crisis, by building maps from the ground up about ecological data anywhere around the world, and trying to develop more targeted and effective strategies to address it. Because we believe there is a greater threat that underpins climate change, and that's the loss of biodiversity. When we lose biodiversity, natural ecosystems like forests, grasslands, and tundra, of course, carbon is emitted into the atmosphere. But much, much more importantly than that, these ecosystems are the Earth's regulatory system. They are the lungs that breathe life into every corner of our planet, and they draw down carbon from the atmosphere and store it within our vegetation and soils. This is an example of that regulatory system from NASA. It's carbon dioxide movement throughout the year, and you can see the high concentrations of carbon in the high latitudes indicated by red colors. And as we move through time and tick into late spring and then summer, we see these colors start to fade. And that's driven by one thing: the emergence of leaves on trees. This very simple ecological process that we're all familiar with has a huge impact on the carbon cycle every year. It's one of several massive ecological processes that all balance one another out, and they all regulate our climate. What we're starting to see here are the human emissions from the heavily industrialized parts of the world as they continue to emit that 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide that I mentioned earlier. The problem is that they're not being offset by any uptake, so they're all gradually warming the climate. Now, given the huge, huge scale of these ecological processes, we believe that properly managing Earth's ecosystems and restoring natural levels of biodiversity is undoubtedly going to be one of our best tools in the fight against climate change. But needless to say, it's not that simple. Because history tells us that trying to restore ecosystems without fully understanding them can be ineffective, or sometimes it can even be damaging. History is littered with examples of ecosystem restoration management gone wrong. In the 1960s, the desertification of Africa's national parks was blamed on the overgrazing of elephants. So, in an attempt to try and increase the productivity of the land, experts embarked on a program to kill over 40,000 elephants across the country. But what actually happened was the desertification became much, much worse, and that's because elephants are actually really important ecosystem engineers. They dig holes which provide nutrients and water for other animals in the ecosystem, and their feces provide structure and soil quality for other organisms in the ecosystem. A decade earlier, in the 1950s, the eradication of sparrows from China was intended to try and increase crop yields. But without the sparrows, insect populations boomed and they decimated crops all throughout the country. And this was one of the primary factors that led to the Great Chinese Famine, which killed over 30 million people. And we see hundreds of examples like this all throughout society, albeit on a smaller scale, where, people have planted trees in the wrong ecosystems and they've destroyed natural levels of biodiversity, or people have planted trees in soils which can't support them, and when they fall and die, those soils get degraded and nutrients are lost. It's been estimated that only 30% of trees planted in tropical regions around the world actually make it to maturity. And that's a real shame, because these are the projects which are saving us from climate change and biodiversity loss. The problem is that these projects don't have the sort of fundamental ecological information about their area of interest to make really basic decisions like what kind of trees to plant and in what kind of soil. It sounds really simple, but until recently we didn't know the first thing about the global forest system. Plant for the Planet, they're a youth NGO with about 70,000 child ambassadors all around the world, came to us and asked a relatively simple question. How many trees are there on the planet? And the truth was, we didn't really know. And that's because all of our global scale information comes from satellite data. And whilst that satellite data gives us fantastic global coverage, when it comes to the world's forests, we can't see below the canopy surface. So we're limited to this top-down approach. But using that top-down approach, scientists had estimated that there were approximately 400 billion trees on the planet. And up until 2016, that was the number guiding the UN's Billion Tree campaign to plant 1 billion trees. But in our lab, we knew that really getting a handle on this number required something more. It required boots on the ground, an army of scientists called the Global Forest Biodiversity Initiative, going out into their local regions, studying the forest and properly categorizing those ecosystems. And when we took that information and then combined it with the satellite data and climate information and soil characteristics, together with the latest developments in machine learning and artificial intelligence, we were able to develop this really high-resolution picture of the world's forests. And we were able to explore the spatial distribution of these forests. And for the first time, we were able to reveal that there weren't 400 billion trees on the planet. In fact, there were a little over 3 trillion trees on Earth. That should change when I say that. There we go. And it really helped put things into perspective. And within about 6 months of us doing this piece of research, Plant for the Planet had gone to the United Nations and transformed the Billion Tree campaign into the Trillion Tree campaign, with a new target to plant 1 trillion trees. But there was a small follow-up question from the children at Plant for the Planet, and they wanted to now know exactly how many more trees we think that can fit on planet Earth. So fortunately, with the ability of our model to go below the canopy system and really explore the structure of the forests, people were able to go into their own areas of interest within Esri's Living Atlas and understand how many trees were in their own particular region, but also what the potential is in those regions for new trees. And when we combined all that around the world, we were able to identify an area for potential reforestation of approximately 1.7 billion hectares. That's an area about 44 times the size of Norway. And we're estimating that if all those ecosystems are managed correctly, there's potential room on the planet for an additional 1.2 trillion trees. We're not stopping there. We're now trying to find new layers of information. So we can tell restoration campaigns what types of species to plant in a particular area, but also what the capacity is in any particular area for new species, how many species can be held in that one location. And in particular, we're now trying to understand the implications for the temperature. Because what a lot of people don't know is that whilst the world's forests, by and large, do cool the climate, in some regions, dark-colored forests actually absorb the sun's energy, so they're gradually warming the climate around them. So really targeting the right areas for restoration is going to be absolutely essential. So now we have this sort of global perspective of the world's forests, the above ground world. The next steps are sort of the holy grail in ecosystem science. It's the billions of species that exist below our feet, the soil organisms. This is by far the most diverse and complex community in the terrestrial biosphere. And we believe that properly understanding the mechanics of these below-ground systems could be the key to unlocking the true potential of nature-based climate solutions. This graphic shows the organic carbon stocks around the world. And Everything above 0 on the left-hand side there, colored in green, represents the Earth's vegetative carbon stocks, so all the carbon stored in the world's above-ground vegetation. And as you might expect, if you're at 0 degrees latitude, standing on the equator in the middle of a tropical rainforest, you would be surrounded by the vast majority of the Earth's vegetative carbon stocks. But what's less well known is that if you actually take the time to look in the top 100 centimeters below the soil, you'd actually find 5 times more carbon stored below your feet. Even more surprising is that that's not even the biggest carbon sink on the planet. To find that, you're going to have to travel 50 degrees north in latitude to the boreal regions of northern Europe and North America, where in the top 200 centimeters of soil, we're finding 10 to 15 times more carbon. It's really, really quite changing our perspective. And I understand that the theme of this conference is sustainability. And when we talk about sustainability, I think we should first think about our soils. A healthy soil is the basis for a really strong global forest system. And that's recently been recognized by the United Nations as the very foundation for sustainable development. Now, for decades, scientists have been taking soil samples in an attempt to try and characterize the billions of species that exist in these below-ground systems. But up until recently, we haven't really been able to identify, to map these species at a global scale. Similar to the approach we have with the world's forests, we have another army of scientists, the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative, full of people taking samples and processing these samples all around the world. And with the latest developments in technology, we now have machines that can process these samples much more quickly than before, and it's generating a whole new wave of information. And what we're finding is that by far the most abundant animals in these below-ground systems are these tiny microscopic worms called nematodes. These nematodes fill every role in the trophic food web, as well as a whole range of other functions, and it appears that the soil is absolutely teeming with them. Yet we know so little about their distributions and impacts at a global scale. This map shows the thousands of locations around the world where people have taken soil samples and extracted those nematodes in order to try and identify their abundances. And if you were to click on any of these locations, you'd get a picture of both the number and type of nematode at every location. But what was really surprising to us is that the huge variability we get from one location to the next. So whilst in some of these locations we've got 400 nematodes in just a gram of soil, in other locations we've got 170,000 of these tiny nematodes in just a gram of soil. So we wanted to understand what was really driving this variation. So we ran a random forest's variable importance metric to try and identify the key drivers. And what we expected was that it would be the climate that drove their distribution around the world. So as we get closer and closer to the equator and the temperature gets warmer and warmer, we see more and more of these below-ground animals, much like the above-ground world. But actually what we found was that it wasn't the climate that was driving their distribution. We'll get to the map shortly, sorry, this is video, but it was the organic carbon content of the soil, the depth of that soil and the geological characteristics that was driving their distribution. And when we took that and extrapolated it around the world, we were able to create a map of this below-ground world. And for the very first time, we can see below our feet. We can see that in those high latitude regions that I talked about earlier, where there's huge accumulations of carbon driven by cold temperatures, we also have a huge accumulation of these soil nematodes. And it's helping us to understand which areas of the world have a really fertile soil that's already ready to support new life, new forests, and some areas of the world where the soils are extremely degraded and they need restoring before new trees can be planted there. But the real value in these maps, we think, is that it's giving us this global perspective, which is so important for local restoration projects all around the world, which for too long and too often have been basing restoration decisions on intuition and assumption. Because I'm sure you'd all agree that until I presented this to you, you would have also assumed that there were more animals in the tropics than there were in the Arctic. And what this is telling us is that it may very well be the other way around. So now we have this global perspective, these layers upon layers of information about the above-ground world, and now, of course, the below-ground world. We're now able to answer some of the most important and long-standing questions in ecology, which highlight the importance of biodiversity. Any restoration project which comes to us, one of the first questions they ask is if I've got 100 trees that I want to restore, should I restore a combination of different tree species? Or should I just simply restore a monoculture of the fastest growing, most productive tree species? And the truth is that scientists have never really been able to give a definitive answer on this. And that's because environments around the world differ so drastically, so you can't give one answer. But with our global maps and the ability to layer on top of all this different information, we're able to start to give a global answer. And what we're finding is that consistently, all around the world, multi-species combinations are always more effective at capturing carbon and producing wood. And that's because each individual tree has its own strategy for capturing its nutrients from either the sunlight or the soil. And when they're together in a community, they're always much more efficient. Diversity equals efficiency effectively. And when we take that relationship and scale it up around the world, it makes a really big difference. When we look at the world's global forest market in terms of timber, paper, and pulp, we see that it's worth about $616 billion per year. Now, if we were to take those forests and replace them with a monoculture of the fastest growing, most productive tree species, the value of that market would fall by approximately $300 billion per year. That's if we have exactly the same number of trees. That is purely the value of diversity, and it really goes to emphasize the importance of preserving these natural ecosystems. And I should say that number doesn't even take into account all the other benefits that we get from the forests, so the medicines and the foods, and of course the carbon sequestration that I showed you from that NASA simulation. So now we have all of this information about the above ground and the below ground world. We're much better equipped to guide restoration projects in many different locations. We work with a number of partners specializing in nature-based solutions in hundreds of locations around the world. And with all this information, they're better equipped to monitor the success of their efforts. So are they maximizing carbon storage in any particular location? Are they achieving the levels of biodiversity that we think they can? And if not, why not? When it comes to that media headline that we've only got 12 years, that really is just an arbitrary deadline set by politicians and scientists in an attempt to try and incentivize people to actually do something about the changing climate. The beauty about these nature-based solutions to climate change is not only are these the best technology that we have, they're ready to be deployed immediately. And with these layers upon layers of information that we now have for any location on Earth, we're much better placed to guide restoration practitioners in the fight against biodiversity loss and climate change. Thank you very much.